So from a gameplay perspective, I think Gears of War has had this sort of combination of a huge variety of enemies, these weapons that each have their own characteristic and their own tool, their own use inside of encounters, and then the focus on cover, the sort of like almost heavy tactical movement of cover means that each encounter can be a mix of, layout, the tools we give you, the enemies we combine, and you can take that core combat and use it so many different ways that as you go through campaign, as you go through MP multiplayer, as you go through Horde, you get actually a ton of variety out of these solid gameplay mechanics.
What were the challenges of pushing things forward with this franchise while staying connected to its roots?
Yeah, having sort of like such a beloved franchise, and one that is so, has this gameplay that has been emulated but never quite replicated by anybody else. That's a big responsibility, and we knew we wanted to make sure that our game felt like it was a continuation of the legacy of the franchise, that it was something people picked up and were like, oh yeah, this is a Gears of War game. But at the same time, we wanted to move it forward. We wanted to tell our own story. We wanted to add new mechanics. So we did a ton of work in the first year with tools, making sure our gameplay was exactly the same before we changed it, like down to the pixel. We did a bunch of design analysis and sort of like reworking existing encounters until we felt we really understood the roles of all the enemies, the way that the cover layout works, the way that fronts work, so that when it came time for us to introduce a whole new army of enemies, when we wanted to do things like adding our close cover combat mechanics, we felt that we understood it well enough that we were adding to the core combat, that we're building around it and on top of it, and we weren't turning Gears of War into something completely different.
What did having a new studio and a new team open up creatively when it comes to the campaign?
Yeah, I think like being a new studio, we're both fans of the franchise as it was, and we're super inspired by it, but we knew we wanted to tell our own story, so we took the advantage of sort of putting it 25 years after the end of Gears of War 3, and that let us develop a whole bunch of new things that built on top of the foundation we had. So we have amazing character artists here, we have an amazing art team, we have a really creative design team and a very mature sort of studio. We're able to bring all of that experience to bear on new characters, new story, new mechanics, new modes in MP and Horde. And I think having that confidence that, 25 years after Gears of War 3 meant we had all these new stuff we could bring, but we had the echoes of the past games. We have people like Marcus Phoenix, we have locations that are familiar. I think we were able to sort of root a lot of our new stuff firmly in sort of the place of the old games. The beginning of this project, it's hugely exciting when we got the Gears of War franchise, and at the beginning it was all about analysis and understanding it, and part of that was building our own vocabulary. So whether it's how we look at design and the roles of different mechanics or different weapons, or if it's when we look at characters and story and how we develop them to make sure that, even if they're new and they're different, we're still exploring things that are true to sort of that Gears of War storyline, that idea of camaraderie and brotherhood, and exploring loyalty and family ties in times of trouble. We did a lot of work around building sort of like best practices and vocabulary so we could talk as a team about this stuff, because we haven't worked on it for 10 years. Right. And part of that was thinking about, where has the franchise been? What did we need to achieve with Gears of War 4? But what kind of foundation can we set up for the future so that we know that we have a lot of opportunity to explore new stories and new places and go even bigger places with future games.
Can you talk about the story of this game?
For sure. So Gears of War 4 is a wholly new story. We introduced 3 main new characters: JD Phoenix, son of Marcus Phoenix, his friends Del and Kate. And I think one of the really cool things about our story is it's sort of like, it follows them through this one night on Serra as they discover this new threat. And that's different. In previous Gears of War games, you kind of drop into this squad of soldiers who've been in combat, they've been in war for more than a decade. They have this shorthand, they have this understanding of the world, which really worked for the previous games. But one of the really cool things about our game is you get to experience the threat, you get to discover it with the characters. So you kind of go on this journey with them, and you meet people, you meet enemies along the way, and you're going through it with them over this one night.
What did that jump in time open up in exploring these characters?
Yeah, so by setting the game, basically a generation after Gears of War 3 ended, it gave us a different sort of landscape to explore inside Gears of War. There's been no war for 25 years, you know? At the time of our game, we're just getting into sort of this new conflict between the COG and the Outsiders, and this time of peace is starting to come to an end right as this new threat, the Swarm, appears. So the three main characters in our game, they're different. You know, they're more idealistic than maybe the Gears characters of the past. They're younger, they haven't experienced this yet, and so they have this camaraderie, this friendship, but it's not exactly the same as what you would have seen between Delta Squad. At the same time, we have Marcus around, we have characters like Reyna and Oscar who lived through the Locust War, and we have the ruins of the Locust War still echoing and resonating around Sarah. And we were able to sort of like explore the contrast between those two generations.
Can you break down the lead characters in this game?
We've got three main characters in this game. We have JD Phoenix, Kate Diaz, and Delmont Walker. So JD and Del sort of grew up inside the new Coalition of Ordered Governments, the COG, that's brought humanity back from the brink of extinction and is sort of building these settlements to control them and build a new society. But at the time of our game, they've actually defected from the COG. They were trained as soldiers, and because of some event, they decided to go join this other faction, the Outsiders, which is a group of people that want to live by their own rules. And there they've met Kate Diaz, who's the daughter of the chief of the village that they're at. So those three characters are our main squad as they go through the game. They're joined by sort of a rotating cast of other characters that will become the extra members in the squad. And really the story sort of explores what it's like for them to go through this crazy night, and also explores their relationships with each other and with, you know, the other people in their lives.
What's the challenge of storytelling in a shooter when gamers just want to play?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like, shooters have always got this challenge of you're telling your story a few different ways, but one of the main ways you interact with the shooter is through a gun. Like, that's how you interact with the world. And I actually think that's something Gears of War has been really, really awesome at it in the past. They've got this over-the-top action sequence feel, really tight shooter mechanics, and there's this thing where, you know, the characters are engaged in the world almost to the point where it seems like they're having fun, even though they're in these crazy, horrific circumstances sometimes. And that's important. It's a game, it's escapism, you know, you want the player to have fun. You want the character to be behaving in a way that feels right for you as the player and kind of feels like they're in sync with you. At the same time, I think Gears of War has always had this ability to explore these, you know, really intense emotional beats, these relationships between characters that are really deep. And we've tried to do that as well. Like we tried to make sure that as we're going through the game, we have these, you know, these layers of story that get built. And then you start building the action, you start introducing new enemies, you introduce sort of spectacle and sequences, and you tie them into the story until you come to a climax. And then you kind of come down and you do it again. So you get this nice roller coaster. And I think that's what makes a great campaign and what makes a great Gears of War game. Yeah, so one of the really cool things with Gears of War 4 was we got to create completely new enemy factions. At the end of Gears 3, you know, the Locusts are gone, the Lambent are gone, so there's nobody left to fight. So the Swarm was sort of, you know, Gears of War is about shooting monsters, and we wanted to make something that felt familiar but new. And you're going to see enemies that feel very familiar because, you know, in Gears you need a mirror, you need somebody who behaves like you do, who takes cover and shoots. Right. And that's sort of the main drones inside the Swarm army. And then you're going to see other enemies that are kind of spiritual successors to guys we loved from past Gears games. So, you know, the Juvie is a guy who flushes you out of cover, but he moves in completely new ways. He bounces off walls. He'll jump left and right, almost like, you know, a good multiplayer player will do. So it almost trains you to react to these fast-moving guys. Right. And then we have new, you know, big enemies and new enemies for Gears on the Swarm that do completely new things that nobody's ever seen before in a Gears game. Yeah, so exploring the Swarm was amazing, but we also knew because of our story, we wanted you to discover the Swarm, and that meant at the beginning of the game, we needed another conflict. We needed another faction for you to fight. So we took the opportunity to look at, you know, what's happened in 25 years with the COG and what's happened with technology, and we used Jack as an inspiration. You know, he's like a big part of Gears in the past, this little robot that flies around with you, and we sort of explored the idea that the Coalition has started to automate things they think are dangerous, so construction and policing the population. And at the time of our game, they've actually started to militarize these automated bots, and they have this whole army of robots now. So it's really cool. In the campaign, you sort of discover these two factions as you go along, and then when you get to Horde, they're all crammed in together, and you've got a lot of variety there.
What's the process like in creating new monsters?
New monsters is probably the most fun part of the job. It's not short. It takes a while. There's a bunch of layers to consider. So we'll start with thinking about the role of the enemy, and you know, we spend a lot of time looking at old Gears games and kind of dissecting the enemy roles and what they do to the player. And once we know if we want the enemy to sort of be somebody who pushes you out of cover or pins you in cover, or maybe a more dynamic enemy that sort of cycles through behaviors, then we'll start concepting, you know, how big is he? What does he look like? What's the fiction of him? What role does he play in the world and the story, not just in gameplay? And then those two streams start to come together. So you look at his silhouette and you make sure he looks unique on the battlefield. You look at how he's supposed to move and that his skeleton is built in a way that we can animate really cool. And once he goes in the game, it's all about iterations. It takes months to get it balanced and feeling awesome. But when you get it feeling right, it's like he slots in with all the other enemies and he just feels amazing. I think my favorite one's the Pouncer. You know, he was one of the more challenging enemies for us to develop, but he was like the most rewarding one as well. So he's really new. He behaves in a way that no other Gears enemy has behaved, but he cycles through all these different abilities. He can shoot quills at you from across the battlefield and force you into cover. If you stay in one place too long, he'll jump on your cover and sort of knock you out. And he's got this great emergent co-op mechanic where he'll pin you or your squad mates to the ground. And so you need to be rescued, almost like in DBNO. But in rescuing him, if you've got him sort of weak enough, you can also open up a kill shot for him. So, you know, he's a really dynamic enemy, and whenever he shows up on the battlefield, he becomes sort of your focus, and sometimes he's really hard, but he's a blast to fight.
What tips would you give someone who's battling this monster?
Pouncers are all about sort of managing the battlefield and being aware of what's around. They can move across the battlefield so quickly that if you've got more than one there, you have to be aware of where they all are. You have to be aware of who else is on the battlefield. Right. But the main thing is coordination. So if you're playing co-op, if you're playing Horde with a friend, like talking to each other, knowing where they are, telling people when you're in trouble, you know, that's when the game really shines, I think.